this panel is a result of requests that we had from you all. They had their first Chile Verde in the International Space Station. And that was grown from seed from Hatch, New Mexico. So that makes, for me, it gives me a big sigh of relief to know that international space travel is now possible. Because we can have our Chile with us, we can still go to Jupiter. Second little item, and again, apologies to those of you that have read this already. I don't know if you saw, but in the New York Times recently published an article. Some researchers at Columbia University, New York, they're doing an archaeological dig outside the New York City, and they dug down about 10 feet, and they found a copper cable. And so they realized, based on the situation where was at and all that, that 100 years ago in New York City, the first communications network, phone system was developed there. Well, some researchers at Caltech didn't want to be outdone, so they did their own archaeological dig outside of LA. They dug down 20 feet, and they found remnants of the copper cable. Saying, aha, so LA had, based on the evidence, communications network 150. Well, the Santa Fe, New Mexico reported that Frankie Lopez, a farmer in Española, dug, he had read these stories. And so he dug down in his garden. He went down 30 feet and he found absolutely nothing. So he concluded that New Mexico had gone wireless 300 years ago. The reason I tell that joke is because it's a matter of perspective. And so what we're going to do today in this panel is we're going to take a different kind of perspective and look at food and agriculture. And so it all depends on what your perspective is, what is true or what is not true. So I wanted to just use that as a little illustration. What I'd like to do now is introduce our panel moderator. You already met Elena, but I'll give you a little more information. But she's a farm-to-school advocate, and she's been helping support communities to develop farm-to-school programs, a strategy they're using to advance food sovereignty in Indian country. She's a mother. She's in the water clan in the Pueblo. She's an enrolled citizen of the San Carlos Apache tribe, and she lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Currently serves as the New Mexico Farm to Early Child Care Education Coordinator and is an experienced practitioner of farm school dedicated to the development of just and local systems serving our families and communities now and for future generations. And I'll leave it to her to introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, Juan. I'm also the project manager for this work. And you guys also probably see me in a couple other circles, including supporting our elders as they try to access New Mexico grown programming, working with farm to people and aging long-term services, as well as the public education department. So really looking at how we revolutionize our public food systems to serve our community members in a way that is appropriate, that is just, and that is future. Thank you. And I'm really honored to be here today with our panelists. Oh. I lost it. No. There it is. All right, so sorry guys, I'm gonna read very old school, but we'll start with Porter. So Porter Swensel is from Santa Clara, Pueblo, where he grew up participating in traditional life in his community and developed an interest in language and cultural preservation. He's an associate professor of Indigenous Liberal Studies at the Institute of American Indian Arts, regent for Northern New Mexico College, and serves on several nonprofit boards. Porter received his PhD in Justice Studies from Arizona State University and is currently pursuing an MBA from Western New Mexico. He enjoys weaving traditional Pueblo sash belts and learning about the history of his region. Porter lives in Santa Clara, Pueblo, along with his wife. Arturo Sandoval is co-founder of the Center of Southwest Culture. Arturo has dedicated his life to civil rights, economic justice, human rights, educational parity, and conservation work. He was on the national organizing team for the first ever Earth Day in 1970 in Washington, D.C., where he was charged with organizing events in the Western U.S. I heard a podcast that you were on recently about that. It's excellent, by the way, 3 live. He was active in the Chicano student movement and Chicano student rights movement beginning in 1977. He was a Vietnam War resistor, refused induction into the U.S. Army in 1970 as a protest against the war's immortality and illegality. He was subsequently indicted, tried, and convicted for refusing service. He has been active for 5 decades in community-based economic development, cultural, environmental, educational, and civil rights efforts in Mexico. And I also want to offer an opportunity for you guys to introduce yourselves if there's anything else you'd like to. Nope, that does it. Those are pretty impressive introductions, I'm going to say. All right. And perhaps Kateri will be joining us soon as well. And so if she walks in, we'll welcome her. She's representing part of the Dragonfly Farm for Pueblo. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with our panelists. We're going to hand over the mic and just allow you guys to speak to the 3 questions that were provided there behind your heads as well. And so the 3 are, first of all, sharing and reflecting on the agricultural traditions and relationship to food in your community. And then what has been the impact of colonialism, racism on these traditions, both from a policy and practical level? And then how can we move into a more equitable future in feeding our communities? As Juan said, we're trying to acknowledge the past and honor it because we can't build anything for the future without standing firmly on the foundation of our past in a realistic way. But this work together, we're trying to create a future. So I'll hand it over to you guys. Porter, your presentation is up here if you'd like
to. So I did throw a few slides together, but I think they're kind of potentially optional, just mostly because I'm a teacher at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I've gotten into this terrible habit of using PowerPoint as my crutch for everything, but it also helps me to kind of organize my thoughts. But this is a wonderful way to keep me on track. So I think, did you question?
I think a dialogue would be really good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That sounds good. So on that first question, my thoughts on it. I would just, I guess, preface it by saying I grew up at Santa Clara, Pueblo. When I was in 2nd grade, my mom pulled me out of school. And for the next 8 years or so, I grew up, we were growing most of our own food. So I grew up fixing fences, irrigating, harvesting. And we had no electricity either. So, you know, we're doing a lot of things really old school. At that time, raising animals, butchering animals, all of that work, right? And so my mom was and is very passionate about traditional agricultural activities. As a traditional seed saver, right? So she has a adobe building next to her house that she saves and passes along those heirloom seeds, right? And so my job was mostly like the heavy labor, right? So I say, like, she gave me a job title, not a name, right? So my name's Porter. So say that was my main job, is to haul stuff from one place to another, lift heavy things, mix mud, haul mud. I've mixed so much mud in my life, right? I don't even know how to quantify that. And then when I got to about 10th grade, I decided my teenage rebellion was that I was going to go to school. So I was like, I'm out of here. You know? So I had a little bit of a different kind of sort of journey there. But as a professor, my sort of, and I think one of the main reasons I was asked to be here today is because I'm really passionate about history, New Mexico history in particular, Pueblo history, teaching Native students at a tribal college. So in terms of reflecting on that first question, I know this, I'll get there. One of the things to keep in mind is that here in New Mexico in the Southwest, we have within the United States, one of the oldest traditions of agriculture, right? That goes way back millennia, right? So when you look at one of the oldest domesticated plants in the Americas, which is maize, corn, more generally called, right? That was domesticated sometime around 9,000 years ago, somewhere perhaps near the Rio Balsas River, the Rio Balsas Valley in Mexico, and slowly moved its way up into this region here, okay? The earliest corn archaeologically that has been found in this area is found near modern day Zuni from 4,200 years ago. So it gives you the length of time that this domesticated plant reached this area. But I like to always remind people that as corn was moving its way northwards into this area and from this area spreading across North America and traveling into the Mississippi Valley and all its tributaries and all the way to the eastern areas of this continent, that it didn't move like you would go to the feed store and buy seeds today, right? That you say, this is corn, it requires 120 frost-free days, you know, and you plant it in these kinds of soils with this level of pH or anything like that. That's not how that happened. As corn moved, there was the reminder that this is a sacred being that requires these songs, these traditions, these beliefs about the world. So becoming a farmer wasn't like, oh, I'll just get the seed and plant it, we're good. No, it was about adopting an entire worldview that was around corn, right? That was centered on the life of corn itself as a sacred being, right? As corn takes care of the people who care for it, right? It's a reciprocal relationship back and forth, right? So it's amazing as you see corn moving out of Mesoamerica, you see the same sets of ideas travel with it. So becoming a farmer wasn't simply planting a plant, it was about adopting an entire perspective about how the world is, right? And that's how transformative it was, right? And so even coming from Santa Clara and our traditional stories about who we are, and our very oldest story about our emergence into this world, it begins with corn, right? As our mother. So it's in essence saying who we were before corn is not who we are after corn. Who we are now has everything to do with becoming farmers. So that's that tradition of agriculture, right? And in understanding that as well is the relationship with place, with the plants itself. I remember when I was a little kid, my great uncle, he would come and pick me up and supposed to help him out because he lost his leg in World War II. So he did some help in his fields or whatever. And he would always remind me and teach me things as I was a little kid about the proper way to be a farmer and the proper way to care for plants, right? And he said, don't forget that these plants in your field are they're your kids, right? So when you visit them in the fields, you're visiting your own children, your own family members. Greet them, to touch them, you know, like with love, right? And affection, saying, you know, these are my kids. Good morning, my kids. How are you doing today? To sing them songs, to have that care and affection for them, to never go with hard feelings in your heart or sadness or any of those kinds of things, right? So these are the kinds of lessons that track back thousands of years about attitudes towards farming, right? Now, the other thing I would add is that as this tropical plant, because we're talking about a plant that came to be in a tropical region, right? Moved into this area, which is anything but tropical, right? That our Parikani, our ancestors that came before, they developed in close relationship with their places, incredible ways to be farmers in this particular environment, right? And it was very place-based, depending on the, you know, I come from a little bit further north, right? So our season is a little bit different. So there are very specific innovations in Tewa-speaking country that aren't the same traditions among the Pueblos in the south, right? Because the growing seasons differ, the particular ways that the seasons change, right? And so if you fly a drone over the northern Rio Grande Valley, where I'm from, you can see the hills covered with these ancestral fields, right? And all of the ways that the landscape was modified in a positive way, in many small and special ways, to impact the land in a multiplicity of ways, right? To bring not only benefits for the plants, your children in the fields, right? But for all the animals and other plants that aren't being cultivated, right? That are the native plants in the area that make a bountiful environment, right? And a lot of that had to do also with with using microclimates and growing some things over here and some things over here and some things over here, right? So that even if something bad happens over here, you still have these other little plots. So that's why the hills and valleys are just absolutely coated with these different areas, right? And little tiny plots, smaller than this room, right? So you'll see like hundreds of these little tiny plots all over, right? And so that when the first invasion, colonial invasion, occurred in 1540, and several after that, right? You can read in the journals, it's like amazement at the huge stores, you know, that were, and oftentimes you'll hear that say, each village we came across had enough food for 7 years in the future, right? Of course, 7 is kind of a particular cultural number that you'll see repeated over and over. My great grandma passed down that you should have enough food stored away for 4 years, a number that pops up in our stores, right? And so that element there of having an abundance, enough abundance to survive through hard times and things like that. It's amazing to think about how people have become so engaged with their places, so intimately engaged in their places that could create a surplus for many years in the future to transcend tough times and to recover from catastrophic events, right? Now, what was not anticipated was a certain dude by the name of Oñate, who decided when he came 1598, that he would take by force that surplus primarily to feed livestock. And some of those first friars reported in protest, right, that the cows and sheep and horses had eaten all the surplus of northern New Mexico in the first winter, and starvation followed. You know, so that was a catastrophe that was, you know, unexpected that would happen, right? So we think about the first sort of impositions of colonialism. I would say that Oñate was not interested in being a farmer at all. And he was ejected partly for those reasons, because of his is malfeasance. And so that over the next 100 years or so, there was much more interest in farming activities, and the mission program that was initiated with Oñate, that there was, those missions were primarily built in Pueblo communities. My village was the home of the Inquisition in the early 1600s, right? Within the first 20 years, 60 large mission complexes were built in Mexico, and those were largely agricultural enterprises. They were big operations to plant fruit trees and bring beehives and plant wheat, and Santa Clara became a key producer of wine for vineyards for growing wine to make, or growing grapes to make wine, because all of the assemblage that was needed to conduct mass, right, was part of these operations, right? So all of these new crops were introduced, right? And within 80 years, at the time of the Pueblo Revolt, there's an individual from up north also, just one of the many leaders of the revolt. He's always the one that celebrates. I always point out, he's just one of many, right? The most famous one. And that there was instructions by him to eliminate all things that the Spanish brought. And it's very interesting to see in the records, all the buried records, that people didn't want to cut down their peach trees. They really liked sandia, right? This crop that the Spanish brought. And so there was this clashing, you know, Pope was going around like, burn it down, destroy all these things, eliminate, and there was people like, but I like sandia, right? And so right away, there's some conflicts going on, right? And so that these crops have become part of our lives. And you can see in the northern New Mexican communities, whether they were Pueblo communities or not, similar practices of agriculture spread to all communities. And partly the reason why is after the 1600s, the Spanish government decided that Mexico was a losing prospect, right? And they decided that you guys are on your own up there. Good luck. We'll send you some wagons now and again, but we're forgetting about it. Basically, New Mexico was a Spanish version of Siberia, right? So leave them, throw people out there and forget about them. So everybody became very closely entwined with our traditional practices of agriculture, our engagement with the land. Now we're going hundreds of years into that engagement, right? And so I would just want to pull up the other major colonial imposition, which was the invasion of the Americans, which instituted a whole new colonial enterprise, right? That was perhaps in some ways much more devastating in terms of agriculture than the Spanish were. And one of the reasons why I make that argument is because the Spanish used a feudal system of government, basically, in a feudal system that used common lands, which is not entirely different than how traditional systems of land use Pueblo communities. So it's like a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap between those two feudal government. There's differences, big differences, but also a lot of overlap. The US, from its inception, was dedicated to the promise of private property. In fact, the framers of the Constitution, those so-called founding fathers, were fanboys, use a modern term, fanboys of John Locke, right? They loved this English philosopher who created this sort of idea that rights and property were melded together. In fact, when they were writing the Constitution and these founding documents, in many ways, you can actually see they're plagiarizing John Locke. So these are not really like new ideas or something. They're like, oh, I like that. Let's just plagiarize it. Cross out a word. So In Pursuit of Happiness originally read exactly as John Locke wrote In Pursuit of Property. And they're like, well, let's put, I was like a student, one of my students doing a bad job plagiarizing. That was the founders writing the Constitution and the Declaration. They're doing a bad plagiarism job. And so when the Americans invaded, one of their primary purposes was to destroy those common lands, to break up the systems of agriculture, and completely reform and restructure it in an American perspective. And that this approach was incredibly destructive to local land uses in a way that actually, in my opinion, is truly unparalleled. So it's a far more destructive invasion form of colonialism because it was not place-based. It wasn't engaged with these lands and these ways of being here in the landscape. But you can see that process, there was resistance all the way along, right? That process didn't really take a real good shape until 1945, after World War II, when a lot of the conservancy districts and the extension agents and the schools, not to pick on them too much, but you think of agricultural elements of Mexico State and other land grant institutions, including IAIA is a land grant institution, right? And the role of making efficient, modern, industrialized agriculture focus of how the right way to do agriculture. To destroy traditional methods of agriculture, replace and supplant it with industrial roads. And so you can see a lot of people after the World War II era really starting to get on board with that, right? They changing over from growing sustenance plants to growing alfalfa for sale in the market. You can just see like World War II is like the mark where it starts to switch over. So those are, I know for a little while, but like this is a big, I could go on a lot more. There's a lot more on there. So
you're the soloist and I'm just
but you know, colonialism is complex, right? And I just wanted to pass that big arc of history, right? Going back 9,000 years to 4,200 years, to 1598 to 1848 to 1945. These are key moments.
Did I put in my 2 cents or whatever it's worth? The first question, let's go to that one first. So in New Mexico, land-based Nuevo Mexicanos are the descendants of European colonizers who forcefully took the lands and resources of indigenous peoples living here in pre-Columbian times. My ancestors also forced indigenous peoples into a system of forced labor and slavery to make the farmlands they took from them productive. Although there were already centuries-old irrigation systems in place here, these European colonizers, my ancestors, brought with them a system of water management called acequias. And we talk about acequias a lot in New Mexico, and they've reached almost an iconic status and blah, blah, blah. But this communal system of water allotments and management actually did work mostly successfully for the 250 years of Spanish colonial rule here in New Mexico, for the brief period of Mexican rule, and up until, I would say, the late 1950s, just after the war, under American rule. And by successfully, I mean Nuevo Mexicanos were able to create a subsistence farming system that kept generations in this place. Nobody got rich doing this, but almost everybody ate and had shelter from the storm. I grew up in the 1950s in the northern New Mexico village of Española, next door to you in the Rio Arriba. I was able to live and observe what in retrospect for me was the last gasp of the Nuevo Mexicano agricultural lifestyle and economy. Here's how it worked. In the summer and through the fall months, every year, trucks from the Mora Valley, from Estancia, from Belén, from Santa Clara Pueblo, from Isleta Pueblo, and so many other places in central and northern New Mexico would come calling to our front driveway loaded with produce. We bartered for lentils and wheat from the Mora Valley. We bartered for beans from the Estancia Valley. We bartered for chile from Belén. We bartered for all types of fruits and varieties of vegetables from all of these trucks. And we had lots of fruits to barter with since we hired ourselves out, our family. We were a family of 10 kids to share crop with our neighbors to harvest the multiple varieties of fruits growing in the Espanola Valley, from Velarde to Mesilla. We kept half of everything we picked from these hundreds and thousands of fruit trees. And what we could not barter, we canned the hell out of. What I experienced was a fully articulated network of farmers across a huge region that developed an entire food system to feed a diverse and healthy diet to residents in even small, isolated villages. Actually, I might live to be 100 years or more because I was eating organic and pooping organic before the word became a catchphrase in the 2000s. This barter system made it possible for entire populations in both the Puebloan and Nuevo Mexicano worlds to eat healthy foods and to do so without the need to earn cash or to use cash to buy these healthy foods. We were all cash poor, but food rich. We supplemented our vegetable and fruit diets with elk, deer, and bear meat, as well as slaughtering whole hogs and beef cattle in the fall. Everybody had a chicken coop, as well as goats for milk and cheese. I probably could not afford to eat that childhood diet today without leaving the nonprofit sector and going into the private business, because it would be so terribly expensive. So I think that's the system that we had in place up until the late 50s, and I think beginning in the 1960s, that disintegrated, and that leads to the second question, which is the impacts of colonial and racism. You want to take that one?
I know, went in.
I'm going to intervene real quickly just to pull a couple of themes that you guys both brought up. So the relationships with food, right? And that is, there's parity in that relationship. It's not extraction based. And the interruption that's been described is when that transitions, right? To extraction, to commoditizing food, making money off food instead of barter systems. Both of those stories felt really rich. And I think the other one, Porter, that you really set a stage for is as Indigenous people adopting what comes to us and being innovators and adapters as we look towards the future. And so I just really wanted to call that out because I feel like that's deeply woven in both of your stories around your relationship to food and place. And so I am curious though, let's get real about the impact of colonialism and racism. And Porter, you did a great job with the timeline. Arturo, I'd love to hear your taking us into contemporary time a little bit more with us realizing those important dates in life.
Well, the only people in the U.S. and certainly New Mexico that claim to be colonized in the classic sense are Indigenous peoples, period. Not Afro-Americans, not Chicanos, not left-handed, no Mexicanos. Indigenous peoples are the only nationally colonized group in the history of the U.S. And colonial impacts on New Mexico's Indigenous peoples have included environmental degradation of their homelands, the spread of disease, which killed millions and millions and millions of them, creation and implementation of economic instability, encouragement of ethnic rivalries, which we're still dealing with among and between our which is a classic colonial trick, and human rights abuses that are ongoing. In New Mexico and across the U.S., Blacks and Mexicanos, as I said, are marginalized national minority groups who are exploited for their labor in the capitalist system. And colonies are exploited to benefit the colonial state. To achieve this, colonists extract and export the colony's riches and raw materials out of the colony for processing. Colonialists implement socioeconomic systems that exploit the peoples living in the colony and ensure they remain in a subservient position to the colonists indefinitely. In New Mexico, particularly, we fit the profile of a classic colonial situation in many, many ways. In terms of economics, New Mexico ships 99% of its cattle out of state for processing. So the value added of the finished product never stays in our local economy. 97% of New Mexico agricultural products are shipped out of state. But New Mexico imports more than $4 billion in food products annually. Oil and gas profits made New Mexico gas fields end up in the pockets, made from New Mexico gas fields end up in the pockets of out-of-state investors and capitalists. And oil and gas are one of New Mexico's top 3 business sectors. In terms of our local cultures and peoples, we continue to suffer from a white supremacist system, including the educational system, the legal system, so-called law enforcement, and the economic system. The data is overwhelming, but just look at the data from Kids Count New Mexico, and you will see depressing fact after depressing fact that indicates our children, over 75% of whom are Indigenous and Mexicanos, are 49th in the US among 16 indicators of child well-being. We are going backward, down the hole in the well-being of our Indigenous and Mexicano-Chicano communities. What happened to our food system based on barter? Well, the farming bartering system that had worked up until the 1950s disintegrated under the increasing demand for cash to support families. You could not pay for education, nor reliable transportation, nor clothes by bartering for food. You had to have cash. We never experienced the Industrial Revolution in New Mexico. We went from a mercantile economy to a post-industrial economy almost overnight, and then to a nuclear economy and a nuclear colony where we currently sit. So rural Nuevo Mexicano farmers joined the labor force, usually as low-wage workers, to maintain a subsistence lifestyle. By the 1960s, we no longer saw the trucks loaded with fruits and vegetables driving by our doorway. Like everyone else, my family had to go to Piggly Wiggly, or as my grandma said, Piggly Wiggly, and Safeway to buy our food. There are many other very complicated reasons why a vibrant food system disappeared in northern and central New Mexico. Jobs that paid better than farming, for example, began to emerge in Albuquerque, at the national labs in Los Alamos and Sandia, and in other sectors. Almost any other job you could get was less difficult than farming. And Mother Nature was then and still is a very difficult and unforgiving partner. And you know this story better than most. Our communities of color are still mostly excluded from participating in the economic, educational, legal, and socioeconomic benefits that a white supremacist system bestows on white people. Do some of us make it? Sure we do. But if you look at the numbers overall, and if you look at those indicators of success for our communities over time, we are not making it. And most importantly, we are not likely to make it under the current systems. What did I say?
I have a question for both of you in alignment with this. So colonialism, right? There's not an endpoint. We are currently living the impacts of colonialism, as you guys both described, settler colonialism particularly. As we look toward the future with that lens in place, how can we cope? How can we innovate? How can we use our Indigenous knowledge and innovate through that lens? Yes, here's where we're headed. Challenge question.
Well, I was just thinking of our engagement with place that has always been so important, going back millennia, right? And how the structures, ongoing structures of colonialism, intentionally strip people from relationships with place, right? And I always like to use the example of Walmart, okay? Just because it's easy to pick on. You could say Chili's, right? But if you walk into a Walmart here in Albuquerque, it doesn't look all that different from a Walmart in Espanola, or a Walmart in Juarez, or a Walmart in anywhere in the world where there's Walmarts, right? The language might change, but the branding, the colors, you'll know instantly where the pharmacy is. You'll know instantly where the food stuff is. You'll know instantly where the toys are. The kids always do. So, you know, that's a nice example of the removal of relationships with place, okay? Because now it doesn't matter whether you're in Espanola or in Juarez or in Connecticut, Walmart will be the same thing, selling the same stuff for roughly the same prices, right? And now it doesn't matter to have any relationship with any place, because all you have to have is a relationship with Walmart, a place-based relationship with where the pharmacy is. And it doesn't matter anymore, right? And so when we think about how that's just one example, just picking on one, but there's lots more examples. You could say, if I walk into a Chili's in Espanola, it's going to have the same menu as in Roswell. It won't look any different on the interior, all of that. These are all representatives of the system of colonialism that purposely and expressly separates relationships to place. You don't have to wait for the truck from Estancia, as Arturo mentioned. You don't have to wait for the right season to eat the fruits, or you don't have to can or dry or any of those things. You don't have to have those and those seasons are tied to traditional ceremonies, whether we're talking about in the mountain towns of Mexico or the Pueblo communities. We all had our ceremonies that were tied with the seasons, right? Tied with whether it was hunting season, planting season, harvest, on and so forth, right? And so when I think about that, one of the things that I want to I always am hammering this home, bear with me, that we get a lot of deficit thinking about Mexico and highlighting these deficits of who we are as a state, how far behind we are, right? And it is important to recognize that colonial relationship that has created those disparities, right? That are also racially based or within a structure that was designed to be that way, right? From its inception. But I always want to highlight our strengths-based approach to things, to recognize the amazing strengths that we have as communities, right? As Juan brought up, the chili growing in space, right? It was from hatch, but to make it survive in space, they crossbred it with Chimayo chili. So I have to bring that up because we're like, and the student that I got this coin was from Northern New Mexico College, right? So I just say, like, it also wasn't just hatch, right? But when they were, this is an amazing story, when they were looking at chili, they were looking at peppers, the whole pepper family, so not just chili, all pepper family, because those are pretty resilient. And they're looking for what is the most resilient plant, the most resilient pepper that will grow out of asphalt, right? It doesn't care. It gives no what, right? It'll grow wherever you want. And they said, what, there's Chimayo and hatch chilies, we put them together. They're the most invincible pepper in the world, right? They don't care if there's no gravity. They don't care if there's no, like, they'll grow wherever. That's why that plant went to space, right? Now this kind of gets me a little choked up because when we think about our plants as our children, as our relatives, as our family, right? When we think about what does it mean when a plant from our community shows such resilience that was chosen out of all the peppers in the world to be the one that could possibly grow in space. Not that I'm condoning that kind of stuff, but it is interesting to think that it is our kids who are the most resilient in the world to do that, right? And how many other ways can we think of and people in our community who have gone through all of these conditions of colonialism, face all of these disparities, still here. And coming from Santa Clara, you know, we think of our indigenous communities, we still speak our languages, even if there's challenges and lost there, we still are practicing our traditions and our songs, right? It's unbelievable to see the impositions of colonialism. How can any group of survive that level of catastrophe and we'll still be out there practicing our traditions, those things that have been passed down through thousands of years of engagement with place, right? So how can we highlight those aspects of who we are, right? Say, you know, I have a PhD, but that doesn't really match the kind of education I got irrigating in the field. It doesn't match the real PhD, the post-hole digging that I did as a kid, right? The mixing of mud in a brick building, traditional houses out of our natural materials, right? So in each of our communities, all throughout the nation, we have our real PhD, right? As was mentioned in the community agreements, you know, that we have this school education that's like go out and outside world. But in our communities, we have our knowledge holders that are still carrying that on. We should be reifying those elements of our communities that are still very much engaged. Those practices that remind us to engage with the seasons and all of that. Those practices passed down through generations of the proper prayers to say, the proper things to say when you are planting, the proper signs to look for in the environment, all of that. Those are really amazing riches that we have in New Mexico. We should be celebrating those things that the outside world never bothered to care about, never respected, right? But we are actually incredibly wealthy in some of them, right? We have some of the most resilient people to survive in this particular climate, right? And to tap into those natural resources of this that are us and our engagements with place and reconnect ourselves with. That's, in my opinion, one of the key ways to challenge and overcome these barriers.
So that's a good question. Before we go from here, what alternative paths might we follow to seek out our salvation with diligence, as Buddha so aptly suggested and recommended to us? For one, we need to build our own systems. We need to stop relying on government agencies, universities, local government, or any other existing systems to solve problems they have created for us over the past 100 or 200 years. I would never ask the fox to care for my hen house while I went on vacation, and neither should you. Too small is beautiful. We cannot solve climate change here. We can't reform the economic system, and we can't create world peace with our current resources. But we can model new, small, powerful approaches that set us free, that set our families free, that eventually can set our own local communities free. And we can do this by using our own blood, sweat, and tears to establish and build our own small businesses based not on capitalist principles, but on collaborative principles of fairness and justice and love for each other. This is really, really, really hard to do, and it's a pain in the ass, but it beats capitalism all to hell. Number three, we need to create pre-figurative models for a post-capitalist economy. We can do this through cooperatives, through clans, through kinship, through extended families, by going back to the future. We can and must self-fund our own initiatives, whatever form that may need to take. We have always been excluded from the investment capital system and the banking system. That is not going to change anytime soon. So we need to self-finance our food businesses as much as possible. We are certainly doing that as one of our guiding principles at our center. Or we need to create and complete the circle. That is, we must not only grow our own food, but we need to make sure that our children and our families are eating that food. That requires us to sell our product to our community schools, to our elder centers, to our own self-created farmers markets. We can create a complete circle to sustain ourselves within our own communities, no matter how small or how isolated we might think we are. Number five, we must keep our eyes on the prize. We need to see our work in the food sector as just the first step toward the total transformation of our communities into healthy, self-sufficient entities that can feed themselves, can control the education of our children, can manage the healthcare systems for our own peoples, and can impact local, state, and federal policies through our unity and vision. Food sovereignty is just the first step toward our freedom. Number 6, we must develop in each other and in our communities a deep capacity for critical thinking. We can do this through study, through ongoing education that comes from each other and from the best that our land-based traditions and cultures can provide us. No one person or group is exceptional. We can all be greedy. We can all be mean-spirited. We can all exploit others. But we have in our traditional communities a blueprint from the past that can create a new future. That is the question I'm most interested in pursuing. How do we do all this? I don't really know. But at least I'm willing to try, even if it is 1 acre at a time, even if it requires us working our butts off and having 10-year instead of 12-month horizons. Even if it requires of us to be disciplined and honorable. We have to learn how to be good people in our homes and families so we can be good people in our communities. It's much more complicated than this. But at the end of the day, this is the conversation I wish to pursue. This is the conversation we have every day in our work and with every person in our communities in which we come into contact. This is the path we need to follow.
Beautifully said. I really like Back to the Future, right? So catchy. I think it reminds me of the late Wilmer Bluehouse, who would talk about re-indigenizing and what that process looks like. And it starts inside us before we can start to send that out. As the youngest person on this panel, I'm going to say that's been a lot of my work, realizing that I'm a product of that settler colonialism world. I was removed from my culture and had to continue to have to fight back into it. So I can give it to my daughter so that it doesn't die because of that. So I just want to really say thank you for the wisdom you're imparting and for that reminder that it's in us, right? Whether it's in our DNA, our spiritual stories, our language, our tongue, our feet. It's in us, we're from here. And so it's not impossible into the ancestors. We're standing on their shoulders every day. And so I just thank you. I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts. To laid it out very clearly. So I'm curious, Porter, mostly specifically, actions that we can all, let's say allyship actions, that others in this space, in the food system space that want to do better, want to be allies in this work, but don't maybe have that foundation that some of us are blessed to have. How can we position towards a more equitable future, unity, as you said?
I think Arturo put it very well in terms of what it means to, even if it's on a small scale, right? And how you can engage with place, not just in terms of planting, right? But engaging with knowing the history and the place from which you have come into, if you're not from the area, or even many people who are from the area are, don't know as much about what is all the of history, the story of the place, and the deep.
Let's just say this: it took 400 years for the Pueblos to start taking back their name. All of that. But that's how oppression is. Can't even take back our names. Well, that's a good step. It just
one of the things throw this slide up. So Arturo was mentioning that decline, right? This is probably hard actually because the whole numbers are so small, right? But this first column here this is from like extension agents. These are just all of Pueblos, right? New Mexico. And you have 1938 row right here. The little numbers are not so important here. And the track again, 49, 52, 64, and then 81, right? And we can see a change from 38 to 64. And the percentage is really the key thing on the side. I know it's probably way small. I was trying to get as big as possible. Hard to list all the Pueblos and all this. This comes from James Blasich, did an intensive study of Pueblo agriculture, history of Pueblo agriculture. But I would just point out, like, check out like Cochiti in the period between 38 and 64, you have a negative 76% decline, right? And negative 73% in Nambe, negative 80% in Jemez, right? San Ildefonso, negative 51, right? Santa Clara, we have plus 87%, which is probably not accurate. Somebody messed up on the numbers back here, so you know everybody's negative something, and Santa Clara's like plus, like somebody. But anyway, somebody moved a digit or something. But you can see general trend there. The overall general trend is a negative 32% in aggregate, right? So I just put this up real quick to show, like, just to what Arturo was saying. These are just Pueblo communities, but the same could be said about all of the farming communities in Mexico. This massive decline. This is like 64, and in a lot of cases 81. We don't have full numbers that also decline some more, few gains, but there's general decline, right? So this just shows the level. In some cases, really dramatic decline, right? And I was born in the 80s, so like this one right here. And I remember as a little kid, there was at the Pueblo a lot of people that were still farming, a lot of fallow fields, a lot of farming. Though as time went on in my life, less and less. There's fields that are all growing up with Chinese elm. You know, the fences are totally falling down, right? And one of the things, that's all. Crazy stat, right? But one of the things that was really cool to see, because my mom has all of these traditional feasts. Every year she would broadcast to the whole community. Anybody who wants seeds, come get some seeds. Anybody who wants some seeds, come. Like maybe every other year. Last year, because of the pandemic, 47 people came and asked, you know what I mean? Way more people asking for seeds. And all of a sudden, for the first time, I'm seeing like dive into the fields. There's like fields planted all over the place, right? Which was really cool just to see that happen, right?
Don't worry about it.
So anyway, thinking about that amazing moment, like the pandemic and these kind of like, there's a lot of downsides to that, but just to see not only in our community, but surrounding communities, lots of people growing crops. I mean, and I think, how can we foster that and encourage that? You know, I know people are like, oh, back to work now, right? But now a lot of people who maybe haven't planted, their kids, their grandkids, right? We're now irrigating or, you know, chasing rabbits out of there, whatever is all the different parts of that experience, right? Now have experienced that, right? And so it's a moment, an amazing moment right now in some ways. Think about how to engage all of the community in shared engagement with place, you know, whatever that looks like in particular.
And let me say that when the pandemic first hit in March and everything went to hell, everybody made a rush for the toilet paper, but those of us that knew better went for the beans and the rice. But what it showed, it also, we had the same experience in that we were really inundated by people around the state wanting to start farming because they saw how fragile, supposedly superior food system, international global food system was, and in fact, it's hanging by a thread. And we're still experiencing it now in terms of the supply system just not being able to process it, even though most of it's garbage. Junk trying to sell us, but it's really a very fragile system. And at the end of the day, we do need to go back to the future, and that therein lies the salvation, because we still own arable land. Our community, I'm talking about Chicanos, land-based communities in Pueblo, and we still have the senior water rights. To the extent there's water, we still have the senior water rights. And we still have drought tactics and approaches to growing that have been much worse than the droughts we're going through now. And our ancestors survived. They knew how to do it. They have no seeds. So this is a great opportunity for us to, from the depths of this horrible time we're going through, which is the pandemic, to rethink what really is worth doing and how we get back to it. And we can overcome a lot by learning from what the pandemic showed us.
You're dealing with a tech thing. Kateri is on Zoom. So we're trying to figure out how to bring her in. This is on Zoom. So sorry, guys. So we'll just keep kind of chatting. We're going to move into questions and answer time as soon as we hear from Kateri. But in the meantime, what we're asking, just to keep things kind of streamlined and so that our Zoom participants can participate too, is if you have a question, just jot it down on a piece of paper, a little scrap, and we can come and collect it from you. Juan will collect it from you, and we'll bring them up here, and then we'll know all the questions we have.
Hello? Hello?
That's in place, and it's only 3 crops across 12 states: corn, and it's soybeans, and it's sorghum. Oh no, it's corn. Yeah, and that's all you see. It's just terrible. So I think, you know what, Monsanto owns the Congress because that's the nature of our political system. And yes, we have to worry about it. And we're already fighting the hard action against those kinds of false practices.
And I would just add on to that, like, I know of at least one Pueblo. There may be more. I only know one. But that all indigenous communities, we have our inherent sovereignty. We have legal nations, right? And again, the pandemic has served as a really nice reminder of the powers, sovereign powers that tribes have, right? So you'll see that we haven't been really walking lockstep with the state heads. That we have, like, my village, we have checkpoints, all that, which is in a way a declaration or a binding declaration, like, hey, we're sovereign nations. We can say no one can be out after this time. We can say no one can drive on these roads. And that's the end of the story, right? It's a good reminder of the powers that we have, and a reminder that we can, like Mexico, and in no different a way, declare those things are banned from our. So that any nation should look at that seriously, protect our traditions and everything like that. It can be tricky because sometimes it's our own people buying those seeds and planting them because they're like, oh, this is easy to get them. You know, so it can be tricky, but a lot of it, there's an education.
I want to just say that we're talking about the Monsanto land in Mexico, is that Monsanto for many, many, many generations really worked hard on moving their seed into Mexico. They paid farmers, Pueblo farmers, their seed. So this change that happened really happened by the self-determination of the Pueblos that have communal land and have farmed that way for generations. So, I mean, 20 years ago, when they were in the midst of fighting Monsanto coming in, paying farmers to use their seed, many farmers put their lives on the line. That's how deep and strong the commitment was to culture and the way of going through the generations. So again, just bringing it up that we make the difference. We make those changes in how we view. And right now here in the state of New Mexico, a lot of the stuff that Arturo brought up, we are making that pathway already. That's why we're all here. In our own way, in our own little steps. And right now, the biggest challenge is that years of support of big agriculture in the state. Big agriculture that this day will still uses Monsanto seed, that exports all of the product from the state. And when it exports all of the water, all of the soil health that it takes to grow that. And aside from that, they still use dangerous chemicals to continue to grow that food. So now we have this resurgence of the small scale farmer using organic practices, using all of that knowledge of soil health, of water retention, of working collectively together, and trying to find the pathways, the resources of that local investment. How do we feed our own people? There's money. I mean, the numbers that Arturo brought up, what is spent on food here in the state. So, I mean, so I just want to say we are on that pathway of trying to really make local investment work for all of our community and to keep our food equitable and to keep that investment equitable among farmers that do hold those values in growing food and feeding.
Kateri, can you hear us?
Yeah.
I can hear
Yeah,
her.
I can.
You can have the volume all the way.
Oh, no, I don't.
Hello, let's try again.
Hello.
Oh, great. Okay. Welcome. I'm on the side here.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us via Zoom. Arturo and Porter have already addressed the first three questions, but I wanted to just provide a moment for you to address those questions of looking at, you know, the agricultural traditions in your community and that you practice, and telling us a little of that historical story, and then how those might have been interrupted by colonialism and racism and other structures of oppression, and then how do we move into a more equitable future? Looking forward. And so Kateri, we're also having some Q&A for the folks online. Go ahead and throw them in the chat and Sophia will transfer them to us, but we're just I'm gonna hand it over to you and we're gonna turn the volume way up on our speaker.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for having me today. My name is Kateri Hohola. I am from the Pueblo of Isleta. I'm a cultivator and educator here in the Pueblo. I'm currently cultivating the land that my grandparents farmed for so long, Eddie and Virginia Hohola. And so, yeah, just listening to the conversation today, I wanted to touch base, I guess, basically on like, on systems, right? And so the thing with the systems that we're currently involved in, we're currently participating in are foreign. And I think that's probably the biggest, like the biggest barrier, right? That we have to becoming sovereign in all ways as Indigenous people. We've been heavily dependent on the United States government for our sustenance, and those forms of foods, highly processed, haven't been great for us. So that's also led us to deal with some health disparities related to our diet, right? And so when we're talking about systems, I feel like the way forward is going to be restructuring systems, creating new systems. And that's part of the work that I'm doing here in the Pueblo of Isleta is actually doing that. Implementing new systems of living. So one of the projects I have here, work with the Pueblo Resurgent, Daryl Lucero of the Pueblo of Isleta as well. Our work that we're doing is really about connecting the land with community. As mentioned before, our communal way of living has been disrupted heavily by the systems that we're now participating in. The United States government seen our communities as strong, very powerful, and they understood that if they were going to dismantle who we are as a people, they were going to have to dismantle our communities, which is why the United States decided to start allotting our lands. That was one of the biggest ways that they were going to break our communal ties, break our strong relationships that we have. A lot of the ceremonies that were attacked by the United States government were ceremonies that actually built community and created those strong relationships with one another. And so they understood that, right? The United States government understood that in order to conquer a people, that they were going to have to basically divide a people. And so part of the work that we're doing is bringing that community back together, building that community around our farms, using our farms as a catalyst to educate around ancestral knowledge of agriculture, but also ancestral knowledge of like self, right? And so that's one of the things that we've also been doing as a group. We've been also doing a lot of personal development, right? Because as individuals, we are taking part in these systems, and these systems create a lot of stress in our lives, especially for Indigenous peoples, because they are foreign to us. They don't vibe with who we are as a people, right? They are, the worldview of the Anglo-Saxon worldview is completely different from that of Indigenous world perspective. In that Indigenous worldview, it's all about community. It's about taking care of one and another, taking care of the land, right? We are not above the land, but we are part of the land. And Indigenous peoples, like, we understood that. And so also part of the work that we're doing here is coming from that idea of we're taking care of the land. We're kin with the land, right? We're family. And one of the reasons why we took care of our land with so much compassion is because we knew that we had to rely on the land, right? We didn't have Walmart to go to when our crops failed. That wasn't an option. So we had to ensure that our crops were going to continue for future generations, that we were going to have seed to plant, that we were going to be able to pass on this ancestral knowledge. And how do we do that? We do that through community. And so part of re-educating, or part of reclaiming the knowledge around agriculture also has to do with education, right? Being able to bring our elders into these spaces that we're creating, along with the younger generations, the youth, so that we can pass on this ancestral knowledge. It's so important to do. Going forward, I feel like the biggest things that we can do for ourselves is to start using our land, is to reclaim our land as Indigenous peoples. Because by reclaiming our land, we're also reclaiming our health, right? Because we suffer from many health disparities related to our diet. A lot of the foods we eat are just, they're processed foods. And so one of the things that we're also doing with our farms is we want to bring our foods into our community. And so part of doing that right now is we have a 15-share CSA with the Pueblo of Diabetes Center. And so we're able to distribute food to the community in that way. We're also working on some initiatives that will bring food into the Head Start and the elementary school. Our hope is that we're going to be able to provide food boxes bi-weekly to every student. That's the goal, free, so that they're not having to pay for it, so that the families are actually benefiting from the food here in the Pueblo. I think that's probably one of the best ways that we can start to reclaim these systems, is just by utilizing our land, cultivating our land. That's another goal of our organization, is that we start to educate the youth about what it means to be a steward of the land, so that we're able to take care of it for generations to come, so that the generations behind us that are coming up are going to say, you know what, this is our land, this is who we are, this is how we sustain our culture. And I feel like the restoration and maintenance of our ancestral knowledge is also important. I feel like that's also been greatly attacked, right? And so a lot of the practices that you hear now, like you hear like these words like regenerative, sustainability, they're coming from, they're catchwords now, but these are things that Indigenous peoples have been doing all along. We know how to sustain our land. We know how to cultivate our land. We have this knowledge. It's nothing that we don't have already. That's the thing that gives me hope, is I know that the systems that we are trying to revitalize, they were here already. These systems existed in this space. And part of that work that we're doing is to try to bring these systems back, right? To revitalize them, to give them new life, so that we're able to draw from them and move forward in the future. Part of moving forward for us here on my farm is we've actually switched part of our ag to a drip system. And so that helped with saving water. And it's also better for the plants in that it we're not using surface water, right? And so surface water can sometimes be contaminated. That's one of the things that we're trying to do moving forward, so that we're also being sustainable with our water as a resource, right? Because water is life. Without water, nobody can live. Even the richest people, right? The richest people can't eat their money and they can't drink their money. They're gonna need food and they're gonna need water, just like everybody else. And so when I'm thinking about capitalism, that's not sustainable. Capitalism is not gonna be sustainable in the long run. We can already see that with climate change. We can see that in just the warming of our summers. They're getting hotter. There's just so many changes that are happening in regards to our climate. And that's all going back to capitalism. Capitalism is not sustainable, especially for indigenous food sovereignty, where we're just not going to be able to continue going forward if we're going to stay in this capitalist mindset. We really need to think more in terms of community and how we're going to be able to sustain communities for the long run. Indigenous peoples are always thinking forward, right? We're always thinking about generations ahead of us. So we're always thinking about the next 7 generations. How are we going to sustain our people for the next 7 generations to come? Well, that's going to take a lot of us making some really reflecting, for one, right? Because we're all part of this capitalist system. We all participate in it in one way or another. That's just the reality of it. But what can we do within our communities to start changing these systems from the capitalist mindset to the communal based, right? So in terms of poverty, indigenous communities suffer greatly from poverty. And that's one thing that we didn't have historically. We didn't have poverty in our communities because we took care of one another, because nobody went hungry, nobody was left out when they didn't have what they needed. We were peoples of community. And I think the way that we're going to be able to move forward and to create lasting, meaningful change is through community, is building community, is creating those ties with one another that have been lost. I think that's like, for me, that's the answer to community. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kateri. I just want to also express gratitude for you really humanizing that story and talking about how much it starts with our own individual work, right? No practice is too small, whether it's a practice towards sustainability or our food systems, practicing what we preach around our food systems work, or our own indigenous selves and how we follow the knowledge and wisdom of our ancestors. So for me, for instance, right, like trying to wake up with the sun has been hard. I don't have the discipline, but it's something I've adopted in more recent years. And so those little actions change our perspective and make it all feel possible. And thank you for sharing a story of hope with us. And really everything you said was in such alignment with these 2 gentlemen here, all from different narratives. And so I'm just really humbled for the wisdom in the room and on the screen. So thank you. We have a couple of questions, Kateri, and we'll pose them to you as well. If you want to chime in, just let us know. We'll try to manage the Zoom thing as best as possible. Try and be real high tech about this. So I'm going to start with these guys here. We had a couple questions that were specifically targeted to you. Whoever would like to start. Arturo?
So the question is, what do you feel is the feasibility of transitioning back to a barter system in barter and coal for food? So a number of years ago, one of the other things, having lived for a number of years in rural northern New Mexico, was, and this is still happening, and all of you know this, and it's probably happening in your neighborhoods, but when you don't have a lot of cash flow, you count on your neighbors to fix the electricity. So if you have a neighbor, it's an electrician, you go and say, you know, my lights are on the blink, and he'll say, oh, come over Saturday. And then what you would do if you're good at something, and I'm still trying to figure out what I'm good at, you would then say, well, you know what, if you do this for me, I will then go and I will mow your lawn, or I'll do something, I'll wash dishes for a week. But it's a de facto way that people can help each other without cash exchanging hands and not having to have this huge cash flow back and forth to keep yourself together. So I thought it would be brilliant idea on my part, really brilliant, to formalize a system like that. So I started doing the research on that, trying to figure out, you know what, let's formalize this so that then if somebody in Rio Riva County needs help with an electrician, you could go to a website, create, and there would be 15 or 20 electricians that are willing to do it on a barter system. They would say, and you could put a value on it and say 2 hours worth of electrical work is worth 10 pounds of beans. I'm willing to do it on that basis. So it was going, I was really just on a roll. Boy, am I smart. And then I ran into the IRS. Said, yeah, set up that system. That'd be really great for us because we want to tax those transactions. And if you make it easy for us by actually having a website, thank you very, very much. I'm knocking on their door. So that didn't work. But in a food system, that's a long way around to say, yes, we should do a food bartering system because you eat the evidence. So there's no way the IRS could say, well, you ate 5 pounds of beans. Say, prove it. So I think, you know, that is a really practical approach we should use. And I think it is happening certainly among our farmers where we do the exchange of that, but we could actually do it as an informal network. It's a real network, but we keep it off the internet and we do all of our transactions over the phone. And then we just start doing that exchange, but somebody could actually manage that. And I think it would save people a lot of money on their grocery bill and it would improve their diet. So yes, we could go back to what I experienced in the late 50s. There's no reason why we can't do that. And we should do that. So that's a good question. Whoever made it, really good. Good. Thank you for the question.
I kind of just wanted to go off of that and also refer back to something Kateri said, which is our Pueblo communities. We have our traditions of community that are also have certain ways that you're supposed to behave and how you they're different from village to village, but how you assist, how you give back for help, right? So I'll just give an example. I ate for dinner sijosa or chicos soup, right? And it was with elk meat and chicos, right? How did that dinner come to be? Well, my Hotzatara is my marriage dad. He needed help roasting his corn, right, and harvesting it. So of course he calls up all his relatives, right? And I'm now his kid because our marriage sponsor, right? So he calls me up and my wife, right? So we're his kids. So we go and help him with that. For helping him with that, he gave us all kinds of the crops, right? So we go back home with like all kinds of chicos. And so we dry it and process everything like that, right? On the other hand, every now and then, I will get a call up from somebody that's also a relative or a keep-up brother or whatever, saying, I got a kill in the mountains, right? So a couple of weeks back, I got a call up, hey, we got to go haul the elk out of the mountains for a traditional hunt, right? And then, of course, all that meat gets given out, right? So my dinner last night was part of a barter system. It's not called a barter system. It's called tradition, right? It's the way you're supposed to behave. You call on your whether they're your baptism kids, your traditional kids, your real kids, right? All those people, you call them up and they all come and help you. You share what you got with it. It's basically, we already had that built in. And I think Kateri was talking about some of those systems. How do we lean in on some of those? Back to the future. I thought I saw Kateri had it.
Yeah, in terms of bartering systems, one of the things that we're working on as a group is to actually bring like a electronic bartering system in terms of like a app, but it would actually connect, you'd be able to like log in and get connected on the app and then do like local bartering like within your community. And so that's like one of the things that we're really we're really wanting to explore, right? Is our bartering system. And yeah, it's called tradition, right? That's just something that we had, like it was just built into our community. That was part of community, right? Is to be able to say, you know, I have these beans, but I need some corn. Would you want to swap? That was just a way of life. And because it was a communal way of living, that was also right, attacked. And when I talk about capitalism, I always talk about in terms of like money is not real. Money is not real. Money is an idea that we all buy into as a society, and we give that money power. We give it meaning, right? And so we also have the ability as sovereign peoples to create our own system and to implement our own system. And part of doing that is being able to go back to bartering systems, right? Being able to say, I have a commodity here that you might want. Let's talk. And that was also building relationships, right? Being able to barter with one another, being able to barter with another Pueblo or another community. Those were creating the relationships that would create community in the long run, right? And so that was just another reason why the bartering system were attacked. And then of course, like Arturo said, you know, taxes. They couldn't take part of my bread if I was bartering with my neighbor. They couldn't take part of my beans if I was, you know, if we're bartering. They had to come up with a system that they were going to be able to benefit from, right? And they did, and they taxed us, and here we are today. And so part of being sovereign peoples, part of exercising that sovereignty is implementing new systems. So Indigenous peoples, we have the power to implement new systems. We have the power to recreate systems, to say these systems are not working for us. They are foreign to us. They are not helping us. We need something maybe not new. Maybe we need to go back to what we already know and figure out how we can work it into who we are today as Indigenous people.
Thank you, Kateri. Something I was reflecting on as all of you were speaking is, right, it takes relationship, communication, time, right? And so how do we preserve those things in this modern world where that's what capitalism continuously takes from us? To make the time to go help so that we can engage in partner, to be traditional and follow those obligations we've been taught are our responsibilities and our privileges as Indigenous. I just want to reflect that. And my grandma always says you can't be a rich Indian. Just period. You cannot be a rich Indian because it means you're not being a very good Indian if you're rich. And so it always stays in there, right? Everything we have, we give right back, whether that's to the land or our Porter, we have another question that was specifically for you that I'm curious about.
This question has to do with at the time when Native peoples embraced introduced crops like peaches, crops that are brought in. The cultures create the same cultural tradition around crops. I think there's a okay. I'll just preface that to say that general the Pueblo communities, certainly speak for my community, others are quite private with our traditions or practices and things like that. I can't go into any details, but when we think about what I said, when you're growing your crops, you should be greeting them like your family members, right? And so, but there's also, I would say, recognition of certain crops that are like old crops and old crops that are newer crops. Differentiation generally, but without getting
Of your children and stepchildren.
well, I'm always interested in language, right? Because I'm a language teacher, and so I really am passionate about language. And one of the things I think language tells me a lot is or I'm always curious about which ones are our words and which ones are loaners, right? So, you know, for example, right away, think of us, sandia and tewai, watermelon. So that's a reminder. This is a crop we love, right? But we don't have a lot of the other crops that were introduced. Also, there are some that have our own words for them, right? And then quite a few have Westernized Spanish versions, our own way of corrupting Spanish. Those always are like tales, right?
I'm going to try to merge like 3 questions that are similar, so be patient with me here. I think, so these are questions about allyship. So, you know, and if people would like to see these systems created by Indigenous communities and land-based communities. So the first sort of micro question for you guys is, the views that you're sharing, would you say those are shared by your communities at large? Are you ready and what do you need? That's a hard question. Pause on that one. And then how can non-Indigenous communities support the vision of Pueblo farmers, Indigenous and land-based farmers? And then there's some micro questions under that, like buying food from them, so engaging in that economy, staying out of the way and letting sovereignty play itself out in an isolated system, and then collaborating. Is there space for collaborating while we're trying to achieve? So that was like 5 questions. You can address any of them, but they're all about this new Indigenous system or going back to the future and the role of non-place-based people, good allies. And I will ask for the question around, you know, would you say that things you've shared are shared by your relatives, those that you hold close?
No, I would say views I've articulated today and that I live by and believe are not generally shared in land-based Rasa communities. They tend to be very socially conservative. They lean very deeply to old traditions. And no, I would say I live on the margins, even in my own community. For example, when I was a war resistor, all of my brothers basically were serving in the military and serving in Nam, and none of my family went to my trial. Nevertheless, I still believe this is a vision that is viable and that can be shared with our community, generally our land-based communities, and that ultimately the force of history and the power of our argument will carry the day. But no, they close the doors when they see me.
Terry?
Yeah, so I think it's mixed, right? I mean, I work within the Pueblo, and so that I have to work with tribal government, work with tribal programs. And in terms of the tribal government, we've definitely seen some pushback from what we're doing. And I think it's in terms of like, they see what we're doing, but we're also a threat to the system that they're participating in, because our political systems are also foreign. And so they're also implemented by the United States government. They're overseen by the United States government. Any kind of constitutional change that we want as a Pueblo actually goes to the Department of the Interior to basically get the okay. Yeah, they can go ahead and vote on this and change it if they want. So I feel that because we are a threat to these systems, and the people who are benefiting from these systems are definitely going to hold them up, and they're going to protect these systems. Because of that, we're often seen as, I guess, as like as stirring the pot, kind of, you know, because we're coming at we're coming with new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, new ways of interacting with these systems. And so it's been a little bit of a challenge in terms of trying to implement the programs or work with their tribal government in ways that are beneficial to everybody. The thing is that we are ready, right? The organization that I'm working with, me as a farmer, other farmers, like we're ready. We're ready to implement these systems, we're ready to create them. We have ideas, we have thoughts. What we don't have is we don't have the funding. And that's what stopped us like all the time. So in terms of what can people do to help Indigenous food systems, Indigenous systems in general, is we need funding to be poured into our program, into our ideas. Unfortunately, right, we are in a capitalist system and it takes money to be able to create these things. A lot of the times our tribal governments, like they want to give you some money, but they don't want to give you like near enough of what it's actually going to take to create these systems to get the people on the ground that we need, right? Like we need funding for that. So that's one way to be an ally. Another way to be an ally is come to our farms, seek out Indigenous people, seek out the work that we're doing, find those people and support them, uplift their voices, highlight them any way you can, spread the word. A lot of the things that we're dealing with as Indigenous peoples is we're invisible, right? We're not seen a lot of the time. We're left out of conversations. We're left out of decisions, big decisions, especially the Pueblos here in New Mexico. We're not consulted on probably anything, right? And that shouldn't happen. Like we have a big Indigenous presence here in the state. And with that comes a lot of ancestral knowledge. And I think that going forward, if we're going to create any lasting change, there needs to be change within like the political systems as well, right? So Indigenous peoples need to be highlighted and they need to be at the table when it comes to like political decision making. If there's going to be legislation that is going to affect the Pueblos, that's going to affect the natural resources, that's going to affect us in any way, we should be at the table. We should have representatives there to speak on our behalf, because it is not fair that we are continually left out of the conversation. So anybody out there who wants to be an ally, amplify our voices, bring us to the table, help us get funding. Because I feel like that for me, for my organization, for what we're doing, we're really looking for funding. We're applying for grants. We're asking, for donations. We're doing all these things so that we're able to sustain ourselves, right? Because we also got to eat as individuals, but also to get this work off the ground and going, because it's vital. We're taking part in systems that are just destroying our world, destroying our natural resources, destroying our traditions and culture. And if as people here on the ground, like we need to be involved. As Indigenous peoples, we need to take part in our ancestral systems, like knowledge system, food system, cultural tradition, any way that you can take part and be present with your people. That's what I have to say about.
Thank you. Funding and support in the capitalist world, that's a big one. And battling the erasure and the invisibility of Indigenous people, right? And so thank you for sharing some ways of doing that. I think, right, there's kind of uplifting narratives and leaders, but there's also, as you said, giving our Indigenous friends and relatives that space to grow into our own identities and strength as well. Thank you. Any thoughts, Porter?
I thank you for what you said, Kateri. Thinking about funding, right? And from tribes receive most of their funding from federal government, grants, direct funds, matching funds, all of that, right? And it's unfortunate to say whoever holds the purse strings a lot of. And so as long as the federal government holds the purse strings, they hold a lot of that power, and they get to dictate how funds are used and a lot of things, okay, even if there's discretion. And sometimes those funds are, you know, activity happens because there was funding for a particular thing, not because someone needed it, right? So it's like, oh, we have money for you to jump in the corner. I guess we're jumping in the corner for the next year, right? Because that's what they gave us money to do, right? And so, and sometimes those are really counter to those traditional knowledge systems. And I think Kateri brought something up that's really important about engaging with those traditions, right? Go back to something Arturo brought up earlier, which is the Thinkia system, right? And how this has represented community labor and community input. And it's really powerful to see. I think it's every spring in my village, the governor calls up all the men have to report for duty, right? And you'll see a bunch of us with shovels having a blast digging ditches, right? Talking, catching up, seeing everybody, you know. That actually, it's like you would never see several hundred people having so much fun digging ditches, because digging ditches doesn't sound like a cool thing, right? But it's about engaging in community and seeing everybody and doing something that's for all of us all together, right? And one of the things that has happened in the past and continues to happen because of pressure for water, right? And because states like Texas are not getting their cut of our water, all that's those issues. I'm not going to go too far there. But there's been a push for funding to run irrigation and piping underground or concrete, right? And these kinds of shifts dramatically change community activities, right? They impact cultural traditions. And another thing, which is, you know, what I have to hammer on as well, is that water's not just for us. When our leaders are giving their prayers and their instructions, they're recognizing all the beings in the world that are around us, right? That water also includes for the birds and the animals and all the other plants. In fact, when you see the ditches put into the concrete, things on there, all these plants die on the side because they're cut off. And all the animals that live there and use those plants start going somewhere else. And even when we think of the wild plums that typically like to grow along those water, they all just start to die out. That's a major, like one of our indigenous fruits of this area, right? And so those will be like, oh, this is about efficiency and reducing waste, right? We're all watering the fruit trees that grow along. That's not waste. Providing a waterways for animals to come and drink and not risk falling and injuring themselves. That's not waste, right? Creating a space where we can gather every year to work together as a community. That's not waste, right? And so these kinds of, but there's a lot of money out there to reduce water waste, right? But what does reducing water waste do to community? What does reducing water waste do to our water system, all of the habitat around? So that's just those soapbox on the side there about how this sort of jump in the corner activity harm not just our communities, but entire water systems. Right? That water is soaking down into the land in really important and profound ways that we can't fully understand. Even hydrologists don't completely understand how this system.
You reminded me of something Juan was saying earlier, because I feel like it goes right in line with that, right? Like, we're not trying to make improvement isn't always forward movement, right? And so just keeping with this idea of how we practice our Indigenous knowledge systems, not just through the day-to-day, but as you said, really stopping and thinking critically about all of our relatives. And I think that that's another asset that we have as place-based communities, is we understand that the plants, the animals, the soil, the microbes are relations, and we have a responsibility to them. So thank you for that. Sorry, I don't think it's I'm going to ask this one specific question because I think it's really interesting again. So when it comes to allyship, where is the space for collaboration? If Indigenous peoples and communities were striving to achieve or recognize our food sovereignty, future facing, how do we also collaborate and work, or in this case, maybe regional or statewide food system? And what does that partnership look like in a way that has parity and equity, understanding that, yes, we want to look to our Indigenous people as leaders, but they've got about 20 jobs to do. So how do we really support and collaborate across? So some of the examples were buying food from these farms, staying out of their way, or including them in these big systemic talks, right? This is a good example in this room. And I just want to acknowledge, right? Like we do not have, I'll just say, an adequate representation from our Indigenous communities in this room. And it's because folks are out in community doing the work. And it's a privilege and a sacrifice to be in this room right now. So how do we change that? Or any bits of wisdom about that?
This money thing is a pain in the ass. I came of age as an organizer in the 60s. There was a really strong sense in the country, especially among youth, that we were on the verge of deep transformative change, that we felt we had the power in our hands through direct action. Fundamentally change the institutions, the educations, all of it. It was a palpable sense around the world and among youth that we were on the cusp of fundamental change. And it didn't come to pass the way we hoped it would. There was some fundamental changes, but overall the system was able to basically co-opt us and absorb the blows and keep things moving the way they wanted to. But we had absolutely, budget was not in our vocabulary. When we organized, we had, nobody ever said, what's my budget to go take over the president's house? What about this sit-in? Are you guys gonna provide like snacks? Well, no, because we had nothing. On the one hand, yes, it's important to have resources, and I'm as I'll kiss ass as much as anybody else to try to get funding for us to do our work. But not that I enjoy doing it, but I see it as a necessary evil. But I don't let the lack of funding ever stop us from taking risks and from doing the work, whether or not we have a funding source, much to the chagrin of my finance manager. And she said, who's going to pay for that? I said, don't worry about that. The revolution starts at 6. So I think there's always this balance that even this convening, it comes from the USDA funding. It's $1 million. My gosh, we're going to have tamales for lunch. That we shouldn't let this then become the deciding forum for how our communities actually take it on. So my staff does participate in these meetings, but if we decide as an organization and with our communities that whatever you guys as a group decide is not in the best interest of our communities, we'll be the first to tell you, and we'll kiss your asses off, and we'll keep doing what we believe is the right thing to do. So money is a good thing to use. You need resources, but it shouldn't be the deciding factor. And let me just do a little soapbox. Government and foundations are full of shit because they are getting to a point now where they think they know better than us, and all they are pencil pushers sitting in some office somewhere who put in the time and didn't get fired because they did show up from 8 to 5 in Washington. And they're trying to tell our communities what our strategy should be and why this should be the important focus, jumping in the corner. And that's absolutely wrong, and it's absolutely, completely and morally and ethically wrong. But until we can transform these societies and these systems, it's something we have to deal with. So it's always a balancing act. But really, I wish they would all go to hell in a handbasket. I wish somebody would die and leave me 30 million. So if I could get the 30 million, then I will.
I think we all should.
If somebody leaves us 30 million at the center, then I will tell everybody to go to hell. It's frustrating, it's difficult. But I think what we need to encourage our communities to be ferocious. Don't say yes just because they ask you to say yes. In fact, no is a very sacred.
We need to decolonize the land. Because where does that wealth come from? From genocide of communities and resources that belong in the earth. You know, so the trust funds go back generations and dirty money, what they've done to community land. So we are, a lot of groups out here on the national level for years have been working on decolonizing philanthropy, calling out the major funders, their inequities. There's a very important open letter right now, making a lot of foundations shake. They've been called out, holding them accountable to their racism in funding food systems, how that goes to the big white-led organizations that need to come to the frontline communities to get all their data and all their facts. Streamline that money to the frontline communities that are actually doing the work that can put out all that data. Instead of putting a middle person in there because they're the scientists, they're the big institutional, they have the lawyers, they have the research. We have the work, the commitment, and the capacity to do what we do in self-determination.
Terry, I saw your Zoom hand, a little yellow hand went up.
Yeah, I just wanted to like touch on what Arturo had said in terms of like funding, right? And so yeah, definitely experience that in terms of you get funding, but there's strings attached, right? And so you have to do things to meet these like expectations. And so those are the kinds of funding resources that like don't really benefit us, right? And that we're not gonna go for. In terms of like even like Arturo said, like that's definitely not something that we rely on and that we say, oh, if we don't have funding, we're not gonna do it. No, a lot of the work that we're doing is we're not getting paid for, right? Like we're doing the work in our community because we see the need. And while, you know, it's hard to, you know, live that way, it's necessary because we're not always going to have funding for what we're doing. Like we're just not, that's the reality of our work. And so being able just to use the resources that we have and go forward is what we do probably like 95% of the time, right? We're going with our gut. We're going with our what feels right in our heart. When we see a need for our community, we're trying to fill that need. And so, yeah, funding should never be a reason why things don't happen. The way I see it is if something's in my heart, I'm gonna go after it, and anything that I need is just gonna follow me. I'll have it. And so when it comes to like getting out there and doing the work, you're right. A lot of us Indigenous peoples are actually out there doing work. And so it's hard for us to find time to sit at the table when we need to. I'm very grateful that I was able to take part today, even if it was over Zoom. I really wanted to share some of my thoughts and ideas around food sovereignty and the restoration, the maintenance of our ancestral knowledge, that it's important. And yeah, just like I said, going off what Arturo said, it's like funding is great and it's needed, but if it's not there, it really doesn't matter. We're going to do the work in it because we're in a state of like suffering as communities. We're dealing with a lot of things, especially in terms of like right now, the pandemic is definitely stressing our system, and we're seeing the gaps in these. Speaking like from my own community during like the pandemic when it first started, it was chaos. Like there was no system in place to let us know what was happening. very little communication. And that was highlighted by COVID, right? Like those things were stressed. Our system was stressed by COVID, and those were what came out of it. And so I feel like going forward, as Indigenous peoples, we're going to have to be like on the ground doing things ourselves, like pushing these systems ourselves, whether or not we have the funding to back it. We do have the community there. And so again, going back to community building, I think that's the most important thing we can do as Indigenous peoples, to continue to strengthen our communities, to strengthen our relations with one another, and to bring these systems back and revitalize them in our communities.
Thank you.
Okay. Reason I got a shirt. I'm a black person. It's very interesting. We work with a national organization. I got a national perspective and local. I have a real sound perspective on it. Especially like because there's Latino international. Brazil, I'm black. I'm a coaching drum handle. The nature of the drum, how it went in the country, speaks to the culture of the drum, which the innovation of the culture overall, blue-eyed blonde here, blue-eyed blonde in Spanish. Then you have what we call black. Black is in Africa, that is throughout North America, South America, and Central America. So when we're dealing with the indigenous population, I have to think about that. And when you're dealing with people of color, okay? I mean, black Indians. You know what I'm saying? That if we did not have that relationship, we would not be alive. But the slaves, you know, like left south, people home. So when you look at the hues, not only in the Spanish people, but also the indigenous Native American, you got a lot of dark people. You know what I'm saying? So this whole movement. And you know, I've been volunteering for an organization, you know, and I've had people chase major salary off. I'm like, nah, you know what? I got to do what we're working because it's one in a particular direction. You know, so when we're talking about how do we do what we do, what we're doing, I'm with in the last year. The level of funding that it took to put on a major event, and 90 to 95% of the funds that were raised went directly to the event, flying people in, having, you know, I mean, broadcast quality system that would allow for national and international Zoom and various platforms, you know what I mean? Because it was major. And so like to make it happen, when we're talking about resources and how you channel resources, you get to make decisions. You know, you either put it into the people or you put it into yourself. And so what challenged me on a personal level, just like you said, be here, I ought to be out, you know, like I'm a soil champion. So I got to think like, should I do my land like this? Or do I have to do it by hand the way that we did it a long time ago? I'm doing it by hand. So when I'm here, I got to think to myself, I'm not going to waste any time. And if I'm going to share, then I'm going to share. You know, so that's why my question was, how do you, okay, as a panel, engage us so that we give to you? Because a part of what you have to do okay, I think a part of what has to be done is that, because I always look at the room. I'm thinking about like, there's 10,000, 20,000 years of knowledge up in here. So you got to pull this knowledge out of us. Because if we're pounding the pavement, because you can't do it all by yourself, then as a result, how are we going to share that with you as a panel? And as an administrator, you got to pull that out. Because I would sit up in there and be like, get a real good nod on, up myself in now, because I don't have to really do anything once. But so a part of how you got to pull this out of us, I don't know how you do it, but you got to figure it out, because that becomes your position. They're like, how do I pull that out of you? And when you sit up in a room, you're talking about us being at the table. Because of Helga, I'm sitting at the front of the table. So if you don't engage me, okay, as one of the only black man in the room. Okay, if you don't engage me, because I got to know something. If you don't engage me and you leave here and you didn't engage me, that ain't my fault. That's not my fault. And so if we are at fault, and it comes down to that thing, because where, how do we tap into this dominant system? And this dominant system who has shown me that the children in New Mexico who have the worst diet are Black kids. Period. That's what the data tells us. On a national level, we are dying through this pandemic more so than anybody else. We have the least access to health care. So if you don't engage us, what is that guy thinking about? Well, I got thoughts. I have thoughts, and those thoughts are very deep. But if you don't figure out how to engage me, then I'm at fault, but you are at fault too. And that was what my question was. That got slipped under.
Yeah.
No. You see what I'm saying? And I'm watching that. So you have to figure that out. Because see, I'm being responsible. Excuse me how I say it, but sometimes I think like this. Because during the pandemic, when people ask me, well, what are you doing? I'm keeping my Black ass at home. That's what I'm doing. And all my friends were the same thing. So if you don't engage me, I'm going to keep my Black mouth shut. So I'm just as guilty as you are. But I'm a little less guilty because of how you jumped in. And it's like, God darn that doggone hell, I got to jump in too. Because this is what we have to do. The knowledge base. It's the old adage of the little mouse who saved the lion who got in the trap. The little mouse went and nibbled because the lion didn't eat it. The lion didn't squash it. So the little mouse went and nibbled away at the net so the lion could get out. So, the least among us that come with a great answer. But as panelists, as leaders that have been focused, pull it out of us, man, I might sit up in here and give me a good nap for once.
I'll just respond to that. Thank you for speaking up. And this was a panel that we were trying to do remotely. And so I just want to say sacrifices were made and decisions were made. But I hear you and I take it in. But I can't own it all because I was given an agenda with a way to make everyone in person. So that said, my hope is for the next couple of days, there are different types of activities that we can all have those dialogues. Yes, well?
I'll just add that we recognize that because of the Zoom audience and the kind of limited participation as the panelists were presenting. However, after this session, for those that are here live and we're going to go to dinner or lunch, and there the panelists and the audience will have the opportunity to engage in direct dialogue. that we're hoping next hour that we can have this kind of back and forth panelists. So I hope all of us joining each other in the dining hall here in about 15 minutes or so, and we will have the opportunity to continue this
Yeah, and again, I want to acknowledge that what you're saying is absolutely true, and panels talking at isn't the solution. And so, right, it's about creating something that's dynamic and yeah, so thank you for speaking up, and we hear you. And I hope that at lunch, we can all have conversations. We're gonna transition towards lunch, just so, Kateri, sorry, Zoom hand, Kateri.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to let the gentleman know if anybody wants to talk further about these things, like I'm all for it. Go ahead and give my email, my phone. I'm ready to talk to in any way around food sovereignty, agriculture, anything that has to do with breaking down these colonial systems. I'm all for having conversations, for bringing people into our spaces. That's what we're doing here with our farms, is we really want to create spaces where people feel comfortable coming in, being their authentic selves, right? Creating space to be your authentic self, where you're able to express yourself freely in a respectful environment, and we're able to learn from one another. So yeah, if anybody would like to speak to me further, I'm open to it, and I'm happy to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Kateri. We will share your information and certainly about the farm and the projects that you're doing too with the group. And again, thank you to all of you for making time to be here. And again, to everyone for making time to be here. We're gonna move into lunch so that folks can have a little bit longer lunch today, so that hopefully we can chat over stew. I prepared 3 stews with my cousin in the tradition that we do. So we have chico stew with pork. There's a vegan or vegetarian green chili option. It's a little hot, not gonna lie. But there's a lot of tortillas, and then there's